Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm very happy to see all of you here. I see some wonderful new faces as well as old faces, as in previously seen faces. And thank you, Ted, for having us. We did a talk. Mark and I did a talk a few months ago. We had a lovely time. We're so happy to be back. And it's so wonderful to be in the neighborhood where Millay lived. I mean, these are really the streets where she walked. And I'll talk a little while later about where she lived. We did some research, Mark and I did some research to go to each of the places that she lived in the village. So those of you who live here can probably track her addresses, and maybe some of you who live those addresses. How exciting is that? So today I will explore, as Ted mentioned, the life story behind the poetry of this woman who started out as a schoolgirl in Maine, a very idealistic schoolgirl, and she became the best-selling poet in America and a literary icon. But first I want to share with you my experience, how I got into this world of Millay, this sort of unpredictable world of Millay. It was many years ago. I left Rome, where I was teaching at the University of Rome, American University of Rome. I came back to the States to pursue my doctoral degree, and I was looking for a dissertation topic. And my mother had read Millay to me as a child. I loved her poetry. And after a few stops and starts, I decided on Millay. So my first mission was to do some research, real-life research about her, about her background. And I learned that there was a Millay colony for the arts up in Los Angeles, New York. And I decided that I would call and see if someone there was a specialist on Millay or had some memorabilia or whatever. And when I called, I talked with the director of the colony, and to my delight and surprise, she told me that Millay's sister was still living in Millay's house, that her name was Norma Millay, that she was 89 years old, and that she was unapproachable. So I said, what do you mean by that? She said, well, what I mean is that if you call her and she decides that she will welcome you, she'll take you in, but if she doesn't take you then, she will throw you out. If she likes you, you just may end up staying there forever. So I was game. I made the phone call. A little voice answered and said, hello. And I said, hello, and I told her what I was looking for Norma Millay. And the voice suddenly changed and went deep and said, and why do you want to speak with Norma Millay? And I told her I was writing my dissertation, and she said, what makes you think you're worthy about writing about my sister? So I paused, and she continued. She said, I've written a poem about people like you. If you like my poem, you may come and see me tomorrow at 1 o'clock. It's not raining. And if not, pause. And she recited, out from the universities hop the parasitic fleas, the newly appointed PhDs, doctors and critics overnight. All they do is write and write and write and write. Do you like my poem? I said, of course. I'll see you tomorrow. The next day, it poured rain. And the following day, I was driving up the hill 5 miles up a dirt road to Steepletop, Los Angeles, New York. My very first visit. I was terribly nervous, but I've been living in Italy, so I was carrying some Italian gifts and a bottle of Sardinian wine, which I thought might get us through lunch. What I found at the top of the hill was this. That's what I found. I found this woman, Norma Millay, who called herself blonde, but in fact her hair was gray. She was always made up, and she did love to be very dramatic, as you can see there. Here she's in her pajamas. But usually, and when I appeared at the door, she was dressed in a deep green running suit with white piping. She was smoking Pall-Malls, and she might have weighed 100 pounds. So, Steepletop was an extraordinary place. I could see it already, because Norma told me that she hadn't changed anything. She hadn't moved anything in the house. She tried to leave Millay to preserve her memory just as it was. So, we had lunch. Norma made lunch, actually. Peaches swimming in cream, tomatoes swimming in oil. Everything seemed to be swimming in something. And as we ate on a closed-in porch attached to the house. And Norma talked about her life in the theater. This And as I was sitting there in a long chair beside her, eating from Millay's china, and eating from her silver, and drinking out of these finely etched wine glasses, it felt like Millay just might walk in any minute. So Norma took me in. I felt that she was positive enough until she asked me why I liked Millay. And I said, I like Millay because I think she's been wronged by scholars. And then like turned to love, passion, and desire. And she said, won't you please live with me? If I give you a room, I'll put you down the hall. That's Wazuja's room. And you can stay here and you can work. And you can live here and write under one condition. And that is that any time you ask me about a poem, you must memorize it first. And then I'll tell you everything I know. So I agreed, and our friendship began. Now I ended up spending about the next 3 or 4 years, or more like 3 years with Norma off and on. I did stay in the house, which was not restored then, but it certainly had every trapping of Millay. I mean, literally, Mark told you much more about the house. But it really wasn't frozen in time. And I stayed and talked about the poetry, recited the poetry before I discussed with her, etc. And one unforgettable afternoon that stretched in the evening, Norma asked me if I would try on the gowns. These are Millay's gowns that she wore. Many of them were made for her in velvet and taffeta. And they were seen by thousands of fans who attended her sold-out readings across the country in the 20s and 30s when she traveled by train. Now, for a graduate student, you know, her first subject, as you can see, I was thrilled. And then one evening, after the gowns, and after working in the garden, in the rose garden with her, sipping Cointreau in the living room, and eating little toasts with very rich cheese, which was her favorite snack, I felt that perhaps I was staying forever. But soon I'd have to get back to work, which I'll do now. And that is, I wanted to know just who was this Edna St. Vincent Millay. Well, there we are. Norma. Just who was this Edna St. Vincent Millay? So what we all know, or people who've read enough about her, know that she was born in Rockland, Maine in 1892. She was brought up by a woman, a significant force in her life, Cora Millay. I'll talk more about her later. And this was Cora. She was a private duty nurse, which meant that she was away most of the time. So like the Bronte sisters, she left Millay, whose name was Edna St. Vincent Millay, always called Vincent, and Norma, who was second in line, and Kathleen, the younger sister. She left them alone in the house. But she had stocked the house with music and books and art, and she wanted them to be cultured. And it's extraordinary that this little house in Maine, they actually moved around, they didn't have much money, but these girls were brought up reading all the great poets and knowing all of the great composers. And I really must always credit Cora for that. Now, Vincent was the most prolific of the three girls, and this is when she was young and adorable, before she got old and adorable. And she wrote for the school magazine, she acted in plays, she acted in pageants, she wrote songs. She was extremely talented, and she was recognized in school for that talent. She also would submit her poems to a magazine called St. Nicholas Magazine, and that was a wonderful publication for children. Up until you were 16, you could publish. So she was a published poet, you know, even at age 14, and she won the top prize of $5, which of course made her very proud. When she was 19, and she graduated from school, Camden High School in Maine, there was no money, and she got very bored and very depressed because there she was keeping house for her sisters. Her mother was still away. And she didn't feel there was any place for her in the world. She longed for love and she longed for adventure. So I would say that is when her fantasy life took hold, and she created a lover who would visit her in her bedroom. She would dress in her negligee. He would visit her in her bedroom every third day of the month, until over the course of several months he became her husband. And she wrote long entries in the back of her diary about him. Now, that ended, thankfully, in 1912, when reality took precedence, and she'd written this poem called Renaissance. All I could see from where I stood was 3 long mountains and a wood. I turned and looked the other way and saw 3 islands and a bay. Now, that poem would change her life. She entered it in a poetry contest in 1912, which was the prize. There were 3 cash prizes, but the 200 winners would be included in a book called The Lyric Year. She didn't win a cash prize, much to her dismay, but she did win the privilege of being in the book. And so when the book was published, everyone, the judges, the winners, and the audience, the readership, all said the same thing. That was the best poem in the book. So she already had gained a certain level of fame, and that made her very happy. People were writing to her. They were starting to court her. The literary lions in New York were writing to her and asking her about herself. Now, no one believed that a 19-year-old woman, young woman, had written this very sophisticated poem about a spiritual awakening, which incidentally she did claim as her own. And 2 of the people who were most surprised were named Arthur Fickey and Witter Binner. They called him Hal Binner. And these were 2 men who had also entered the contest. That's weird. That's Hal. And they wrote to her, they wrote to the editor, and they said, this is impossible. In fact, they said, the little item about her in the back of the book is a marvel of humor. No sweet young thing of 20 ever ended a poem precisely where this one ends. It takes a brawny male of 45 to do that. So she was very amused, and she sent back a very cute picture of her looking exactly 19. And she wrote and said, I simply will not be a brawny male. When a woman insists that she's 20, you must not call her 45. But I thank you for the compliment you've unwittingly given me, for though I do not yet aspire to be 45 and brawny. If my verse so represents me, I'm more gratified than I can say. So that letter, those letters, and there was a flurry of letters between these 3, Arthur Fickey, Witter Binner, and Millay, for many years. And they were her lifelong friends. And later, as we'll see, they both became her lovers. Now, the next few events in her life read like a movie script. She was still there, trapped in Camden, when Norma got a job at Whitehall Inn, an inn in Maine, for the summer. There were lots of wealthy patrons came to visit. And she was asked to read, Millay was asked to read something, and she recited Renaissance this evening at a staff party. And a woman in the audience named Caroline Dow was actually the head of the YWCA training school in New York, which trained girls to go to colleges. And that was at Barnard. That was the training school. And she offered Millay a place at the training school to come to New York, live in Greenwich Village, and actually train to go to an Ivy League school, Vassar. And Millay accepted immediately. So here, this young woman from Maine showed up in New York with long braids, bows in her hair, looking, I have to say, a bit of a country bumpkin. But she showed up in New York, and Louis Untermeyer, Sarah Teasdale, and the literati were just so thrilled. They started inviting her to tea. And we know so much about this from her letters, because her letters, and I do recommend it, if you haven't read her letters, she writes back to her mother and her sisters, they were all very close, about what it was like being in New York. Now, in 1913, she entered Vassar, and really armed with attitude, because here she was, a published poet. She was 21 when she went to Vassar. And, let's see, no Vassar picture, sorry. And she got there, and she loved the courses. She was very good in classical literature, but she absolutely hated the rules. And she wrote home and said, I hate this pink and gray college. They trust you here with everything but men. Men are forbidden here as if they were apples. And she was very popular among the girls because she also had love affairs with girls. That was where she first sort of started her real penchant for love, I'd say. She almost didn't graduate after spending a night out, and when it was her second night out overnight. But the president finally gave in and said, I don't want any banished Shelleys on my doorstep. So they had to graduate. Now it turns out that she did find a way to meet men at Vassar, even though she was a student. And I'm talking about Solomon de la Selva. He was a Nicaraguan poet, and in her second year at Vassar, he wrote to her because magazine to write about living American poets. And he wanted to include Millay. He also wanted to translate Renaissance into Spanish. So the more he read her work, the more in love he fell with her from afar. I have a few Delicella. I have a wonderful Delicella scholar here. And he can tell you more about her afterward, about him afterward. But he was in love from afar, and he read that his friend Joyce Kilmer, who was from Trees, wrote to him and said that Millay was beautiful. He'd never seen her, but he wrote to her. And he said, "You must be beautiful, like a willful princess loved of many, loving none, with a little dagger in your hand, red with the blood of slaves." And we can only imagine Millay's response. And sadly, only his letters to her exist. We don't have her letters in return. But we do know they have been months of exchanging poems, and sometimes even dialoguing poems with each other. They met in New York, and they spent a great deal of time together. He took her around to concerts, and of course he took her on a ferry ride, which was immortalized in the aquarium. We were very tired. We were very merry. We went back and forth all night on the ferry. Now she was really living at that time. Oh, sorry. He also took her. Yes. He also honored her at a dinner at the Felix Portland Hotel, sponsored by the Pan American Poetry Journal. And just one photograph of her there in her furs, which she loved. Now they were very close, but the affair never actually took shape. He wrote to her a very sad note to say that although making love had not worked out, he aspired to be her friend. And so, of course, she agreed to that. Now, pretty soon, his priorities changed when he decided to enter the army. He joined the British Army and went away to war. But before that, he wrote her a note, a goodbye note, which said, "God keep you, girl, and always remember how I gave myself all of you, the worst along with my best, except my pride." Of course, it was not love. You know it was not. But it was poetry. So they met once 20 years later, and then after he died, he did write an essay about her, which he called her his constant obsession at the start of her village years. So here we are in the village, and from 1917 to 1921, she moved around, and she lived on West 9th Street, Waverly Place, Charleston Street, West 9th Street, and 19th Street, and West 12th Street. She didn't keep diaries when she was here, as she'd done as a child, so it's a little difficult for us to know exactly what she was thinking. But we pieced together her life here from the diaries of Floyd Dell, the wonderful diaries of Edmund Wilson, who ever read his notebooks, they're marvelous, from Norma, of course, and from her mother, Cora, who also kept diaries when she was here in New York. Wilson probably put it best when he said, "She was the it girl of her generation who had an intoxicating effect on people, exercising a spell on all ages and both genders." This is very much her poetry pose. She loved clothing, loved clothes, and she loved these blouses. Now, at one point, the three sisters were together in New York, and we have very few photos of the three sisters, but here they are, with Millay and Norma in the middle, Kathleen, her younger sister. When they met in New York, Kathleen was on the way to Vassar. She would also go to Vassar based on the success that Millay had there. And Norma was actually coming to move in with Vincent, with her sister. It was tough. City life was tough. They shared a whole bedroom in their first apartment. Norma said that the flowers on the windowsill froze. They stayed in bed for 2 days because it was so freezing cold. They would run up and downstairs to the bathroom. And of course, this was also very poor, so there was a cold strike to contend with. There was also rationing. The girls would eat at Chumley's, where they'd get a $1 dinner. And she was busy. Millay was busy day and night writing poetry. Her first collection, which would be called Renaissance and Other Poems, would be a great success, but she was only paid $25 out of a $500 advance from her publisher, Metropolitan Opera. So they were always hard for money. They took handouts very willingly and shamelessly. But still, it suited Millay. Bohemian life was her life. She had many lovers, well-documented, a string of well-documented affairs. Her friends included Floyd Dell, Eugene O'Neill, Edmund Wilson, John Peel Bishop, Max Eastman, John Reed, the whole group that we know as kind of that heart of the village of those years. And one of her great admirers was Floyd Dell, and she had quite a long-term affair with him. He was very different from Millay, and she wanted to learn from him. For one thing, he believed in Freud, so he was an analysis, which was something that was very foreign to Millay. He was obviously one of the editors of the masses. He was radical. He'd been divorced. He was 31, older than she. So she felt that being close to him was going to sort of give her a window into another life. That is until 1918, when Arthur Ficky appeared on the scene. And Arthur Ficky, you remember, was one of the people who wrote her after Renaissance, one of the men that she was writing these flirtatious letters back and forth. And Arthur Ficky, who was in the process of getting a divorce, came through New York in 1918 and wanted to meet Millay in person. After 6 years of correspondence, he came, they met, they had a passionate affair, and that, Millay said, changed her life. Now, she said that many times, so this is, we need to say that a few times. But things do change our lives, don't you think? There are certain things that keep changing. And she wrote some of her most beautiful sonnets about Arthur Ficky. Later, in fact, they would be friends for the rest of their lives. Anyway, and even when married, they were friends with him and his wife Gladys. But she wrote Into the Golden Vessel of Great Song, Let Us Pour All Our Passion, and other sonnets to him. After that, she ended her affair with Bell, and you may remember this poem, because this is one of the poems that was written during this period that really does describe her life, one of her sonnets. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why I have forgotten. What arms have lain under my head till morning. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight that tap inside upon the pane and listen for reply. And in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. Thus in the winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. I cannot say what loves have come and gone. I only know that summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more. Now, true to form, Millay found still another lover among the literati, and that was Walter Adolph Roberts. And he was an editor of Ainsley's magazine, where she was publishing. She was now publishing her poetry, not making much money from it, but she was becoming known. And he suggested that she write prose, because it was just a better bet for making money. So she started writing under the pseudonym Nancy Boyd. She wrote Dorothy Parker-type satirical sketches, and she wrote some short stories. And she was very careful to always write prose under Nancy Boyd because she didn't want that to be mixed up with her poetry. She felt that it was of lesser quality. So you often see a Vanity Fair magazine with Edna St and Nancy Boyd in the same issue. Now she also got a kick out of this alter ego, and when she did finally issue a book by Nancy Boyd, the preface was by Edna St. Now the girls decided to move to Charleston Street, and there they would welcome their mother, Cora Millay. There it is, Charleston Street, and then there she is. That is Cora Millay. Now I know it's not a great shot, but I wanted you to see her because she was such a character. She came to keep house and sew costumes and help the girls. And when she arrived at Grand Central Station, in her suitcase, she had a quart of gin for the girls, a pound of chewing tobacco, and some cigarette papers to roll the tobacco. And I'm serious, that's really what she brought. Those are her gifts. And Edmund Wilson described her, I think, best. He said that she used to sit with the girls in Chelmsford or another downtown venue, and she would sit and look quizzically at people, sort of back and forth, and smoke cigarettes one after another. And then sometimes blurt out inappropriate comments. I'm not sure if she had Tourette's or what, but anyway, she's startling comments that he said were really not appropriate for a woman her age. But she was in some ways almost Bohemian at all, and she did actually act in a few of the Provincetown plays. Now, Provincetown Players, as many of you I'm sure know, was really, that was where everything was happening. It was where Eugene O'Neill was showing his plays. And that's where Millay, in addition to becoming famous for her poetry, she had written a play called Are You to Compliment? An anti-war play. And when it played there with Charlie and Norma, both in the cast, it got rave reviews. The New York Times called it the most beautiful play now in New York. That also attracted the attention of Edmund Wilson. That's the first time she really met Edmund Wilson. And in his 1920 diaries, he recalls how he fell madly in love with her, how she was his first lover, and how he felt that they should be together forever. And he said to her one day, by the time we're 50 years old, we'll be two of the most interesting people in New York. To which she replied, you behave as if you're 50 already. 25. So she could be ruthless, pitting lovers against one another. Another Vanity Fair editor, John P. Bishop, was also in love with her. And one night after dinner, Wilson recalls, three of them sat on her bed. Wilson wrote, John and I held Edna in our arms, according to an arrangement she insisted on herself. I held her lower half, and John held her upper, and we were having a polite exchange of pleasantries as to who had the better share. Millay called us the choir boys of hell. Now, we see the same kind of openness in a more serious way in her poetry, which was considered for some to be shocking. She had a broad range of subject matter, the universals, sex, death, war, nature, stewardship of the earth, patriotism. But her subject, that no other woman was really treating in poetry in those days, was women's sexuality. She was writing, I too be born a woman and distressed by all the needs and notions of my kind. And, O moon, O almighty sex, go forth at nightfall, scream like a cat. I mean, these were words that never had never come out of a woman's pen before. And she was very proud of that, and she knew that. And she was very haughty about the fact, proud, and at times haughty, but the fact that she did not want to bend to modernism. She didn't want to change her style. She loved the old forms. So she preferred the sonnet, ode, elegy, all the traditional forms. And her idea was to take those forms and to write about modern subjects using those forms, which would be a different type of poetry. Now, it worked for some, obviously, it didn't work for others. It certainly didn't work for the modernists. But some of her poems, and probably the most lasting, are the ones in which she did take this sort of unfamiliar subject matter and translate it into poetry. Here's one about riding on the subway, again in traditional sonnet form. If I should learn in some quite casual way that you've gone, not to return again, read from the back page of the paper, say, held by a neighbor in a subway train, go at the corner of such a street, this avenue, so the papers filled. A hurrying man who happened to be you, at noon today, had happened to be killed. I could not cry aloud. I should not cry aloud or wring my hands in such a place. I should but watch the station lights go by with a more careful interest on my face, or raise my eyes and read with greater care where to store furs or how to treat the hair. Now, by 1921, Millay was actually tired of all the attention. She went to Europe for 2 years, and I'm going to skip this part of her life, which again, there's so much in it, but when she came back from Europe, she went there, and Cora joined her. Once again, such a close-knit family. Cora joined her, lived in England with her, and when they came back together in 1923, she found herself famous, and more famous than before. She won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. Her book, The Harp Weaver, had sold very well. And in 1923, another important event in her life, she met a man named Eugene Wilson. Here's Eugene. She met Eugene at a party, a charades party, in which they were fixed up by Floyd Dell and none other than Arthur Fickey, who now was there with his wife, not yet wife, almost white Gladys Brown. They were engaged at the time. And they played charades, and they fixed Eugene and Ray up together as a couple. They were a spoof, and it was a couple who were supposed to fall in love during the charade. And of course, it translated into reality right away, because a few months later they were married. Now, this is Millay's wedding gown, and it's a lovely little red dress, and that absolutely beautiful veil, which was a mosquito net, which was on the porch of the house where we met. And Norma felt that she needed a veil, so Norma gathered it up in her arms, and she dressed Millay. And in the photographs, I must say, it looks quite elegant. Now, this is when, right after the wedding, unfortunately, Millay was not well. She always had intestinal problems, and literally, the day of the wedding, Eugene drove her to New York Hospital, for intestinal surgery. And as she went in, she said, having just won the Pulitzer Prize, well, at least if I die now, I'll be immortal. So during her recovery, they lived at Bedford Street, in a wonderful little slim house, a 9.5 feet wide and 30-foot deep house here in New York. And I just read that it was on sale for $4.2 million several years ago. I told you in 2013 it was sold for $3.5 million. But that little slim house, they lived there for a very short time. They went around the world on a cruise for a honeymoon, and when they came back, Millay was tired of living in the city. So she looked in the New York Times, she saw an ad for a 435-acre dairy farm for $9,000, and they bought it right away. It's called Steepletop. Now, it was in terrible shape when they first got there, and she wrote back to her mother, I don't know whether I'm writing with a pen or a screwdriver, but eventually they shaped the place up and they made these beautiful gardens. And again, Mark will tell you more about the way it looks now. Eugene loved being a gentleman farmer. She loved being outside, she loved gardening. She kept very detailed gardening journals in which she did all my weeding without a stitch about a marvelous tan. And it was also the site of legendary parties where the flowers were watered with gin outside the bar, and they had a pool, a spring-fed pool, where en entourage was the only way to go. They would spend the rest of their lives at Steepletop, with the exception of a few reading tours. It was there that she wrote The King's Henchman, which was her opera libretto. She wrote with Deems Taylor, and that opened at the Met to rave reviews, then traveled to 30 cities. That was in 1927. That same year, she went up to Boston, where she was one of the protesters at the Sacco Vanzetti trial. And she even met with Governor Fuller of Massachusetts to try and plead for their release. But unfortunately, as we all know, no one was successful in doing so. That was one of the only things she did politically. People often talk about her being so political, but in fact she wasn't really. She had very strong convictions, but later we'll hear about her in World War II, but she didn't do very much in her life politically. She wasn't really an activist. Now, a new drama was about to begin with another man named George Dillon. This beautiful-looking man. He was very, very intense, soft-spoken, delicate. She met him on one of the reading tours in which he was wearing those gowns that I was trying on and tried on. And I failed to mention that her shoes were all handmade, sequined, or feathered shoes, size 4.5. A tiny little feet. And at this tour in Chicago, she stopped in Chicago, she met this young poet, George Dillon, and they had an immediate connection. And it was a love affair that really changed her life. Partly because she wrote one of her collections of poetry, not all about him, but many of the sonnets were about him, called Fatal Interview. Now, Eugene, just to mention Eugene, I haven't said much about him, such a fascinating character because he had been psychoanalyzed by Jung. He felt that anything that was good for Millay was good for him, including another lover. So he welcomed George into their home, and he wrote these rather curious notes. I'll just share a piece of one little odd note with you. He wrote, "Dear George, I'm going to make you love me, and you must make me love you. So put on a gay tie, pack your evening clothes, and a clean shirt. Come up and we'll drink wine together and laugh together. Affectionately, Eugene." So he became a part of their lives for a few years, and he did visit Steepletop many times. At one point, he and Millay went to Paris together. Now, the book Fatal Interview I mentioned because this really will give you an idea of how popular she was. She was America's best-selling poet in 1931. The book sold 33,000 copies in the first 6 months and 50,000 in the first year. And it was all sonnets. It was 53 sonnet sequence in which she talked about the rise and fall of a love affair. And I'll just share one with you, which is probably one of her most famous sonnets, which is also often quoted as the only sonnet she ever wrote, because people like to think of her as a love poet. And she wasn't just that. But this is still one of my favorites. Love is not all. It is not meat, nor drink, nor slumber, nor roof against the rain, nor yet a floating spar, and rise and sink and rise and sink again. Love cannot fill the thickened lung with breath, nor clean the blood, nor set the fractured bone. Yet many a man is making friends with death, even as I speak, for lack of love alone. It well may be that in a difficult hour, pinned down by pain and moaning for release, or nagged by want past resolution's power, I might be willing to sell your love for peace, or trade the memory of this night for food. It well may be. I do not think I would. Now, I'm going to move now right up to 1936. And this last maybe decade or so of Millay's life was a sad one. It was a bit of a downward spiral. And it started in 1936 when she fell out of a moving car and she injured her shoulder. And from that, based on her pain, because she had so much pain, they put her on morphine. So from that moment forward, she was very heavily into morphine and also alcohol to manage the pain. She did publish 3 more books, and she did write Conversation at Midnight, which was the first time she'd ever written from a male point of view. It was a series, really a verse drama written by 6 men. And so it's a very interesting book. But after that, she took a strong anti-pacifist stand during the war and just before the war, and she wrote a book which was really so far beneath the quality of her earlier work that critics just damned her. And these dismal reviews contributed to this increasingly nervous state of mind at the end of her life. She was commissioned several times by the Writers' War Board, who asked her to read on the radio, but she never really came back to her old self, I would say. Also, a few additional shocks that happened to her in the 1940s. Her sister died, Kathleen, from alcoholism, age 46, and her editor, Eugene Saxton, died. In 1944, she herself admitted herself into Doctors Hospital here in New York because she felt she was having a nervous breakdown. When she came out of the hospital, she found that Arthur Fickey was diagnosed with cancer, and she was about to lose him too. So she and Eugene stayed close to home, close to Steepletop, in 45, 46, 47. In 1949, Eugene himself went into the hospital. He had cancer and he died on the operating table. So at the end of 1949, Millay was terribly shaken. She collapsed from mental and physical exhaustion. She checked herself into the hospital again, and then she drank until she broke down, and they put her back in again. So that last year of her life was a difficult one. She came back, when she finally did, she was released from the hospital, and decided she wanted to go to Steepletop and stay there alone and work through her grief. So she got back to Steepletop, and she started to write again. But some of the writing that came out of those days, and some of the very heartfelt, sad letters that we read now, make you realize what she was actually going through. She disconnected her phone. She wouldn't see Norma. She didn't want to see any of her friends. And she wrote in her diaries that she sang Christmas carols alone, singing there at Christmas and at Thanksgiving. She was so that she couldn't read. So she relied on Mary Herron, who was the postmistress, and she relied on John Pinney, who was the workman who would always help them in the house, the caretaker. And in 1950, by the fall, she was beginning to feel slightly better. She was starting to write again. She was starting to translate the classics. And she completed a Thanksgiving poem, which we often call Thanksgiving 1950, for the Saturday Evening Post, which was indeed published in the Saturday Evening Post. Unfortunately, she would never see it published. On the night of October 18th, had been proofing translations, and she was about to go to bed, and she left a note for the housekeeper. It is 5:30, I've been working all night, I'm going to bed, good morning, Edna St. Vincent Millay. Now, there are many versions of her last moments. Most are fictional, some are quite dramatic. I think I've probably heard them all. But all we know for certain is that that night she went back upstairs and took a fall down the stairs, and she didn't survive. She was found the next afternoon by John Penny, who came into the house to lay the fire. She was 58. And soon after, Norma and Charlie moved into Steepletop, and Norma became the keeper of the flame, preserving her sister's memory. She published On the Harvest, a collection of her work, the unpublished work, and excerpts from the journals. She also published collected poems. And in 1986, I was with Norma, as you can see here, in 1981. But in 1986, Elizabeth Barnett, who was then a literary executive, and I were with Norma when she died at Steepletop in Millay's bed at age 92. And we did what Norma had requested. We placed the papers in the Library of Congress, and then since then we've been publishing books, so we're now the keepers of the flame. I'd like to leave you with a few unpublished lines that Norma found in a notebook in Millay's writing cabinet. I hear the rain, it comes down straight. Now I can sleep, I need not wait to close the windows anywhere. Tomorrow, it may be, I might do things to set the whole world right. There's nothing I can do tonight. Now, thank you so much for having me, and I'd like to welcome you to Steepletop. My colleague and friend Mark Oberski will take you on a private tour, and you'll see the wonderful transformation of that place since Norma's death in 1986. I'm sure Norma and the land would approve. Thank you.
Thank you. How many of you have ever been to Steepletop? Oh, wow. Good number. Well, for those of you who haven't, hopefully I can inspire you to come and take a visit. But maybe it's best to give you a little background on the timeline of things. Holly sort of mentioned that while Norma was still living there in 1972, the house was put on the National Register of Historic Places, and it was done for its literary significance in American history. And then in 1986, well actually before that, Norma in 1978 started the Millay Society. It was her dream that everything be preserved for future generations. And then upon Norma's death in 86, the Millay Society became the stewards of Steepletop. Two big events happened that because the house was not in very good condition, Norma really just mothballed everything to preserve it, but Norma didn't have a lot of money. So it was Norma's wish that all Millay's papers be sold to the Library of Congress, and that was finally realized in 1996, and then we also sold about 450 acres of property to the state of New York to be annexed on a state forest that's right near the property. And then that gave us the money really to fix the house up and open it to the public, which we did in 2010 for the first time for tours. It's now a house museum. And then in 2013, we really started to ramp up our game, as you will. So with a lot of marketing efforts and increased our staff. And now this year in 2015, we'll welcome about 1,500 visitors to Steepletop, which is actually 50% more than last year. So it looks as though we're on a very good trajectory. Steepletop was named for the Spirea tomatosa, which is also called steeplebush, and it's a wildflower that grows at the top of the property in the meadows. Our head gardener, Michael Minchak, is here with us tonight. He's been trying to propagate them and preserve them because they were quickly dying out, and he has successfully saved large swaths of them. So and they're coming back really well, so that's really great to see. Millay loved that flower, and that's why she called the place Steepletop. It's really a magical place. We still have about 200 acres of land, all to be explored. We own 3 large buildings. One is Millay's house. There is another farm that Millay and Eugene bought just after they moved into Steepletop across the road. And that house we just renovated and is now a visitor center. Then there's a large garage and studio. We have 6 outbuildings, which includes Millay's writing cabin, a tennis house, a potting shed, an ice house, a chicken coop. So there's a lot of work, as you can imagine, to keep that place up. We do it primarily with a huge volunteer staff. We have very few paid staff, only 3 paid people, and 2 of those are part-time. The rest of us are all volunteers, including the board. So it's a labor of love, to be sure. This is the house as it sits today. It sits up on top of a secluded area of the property. I had to take this photograph in winter because it's the only time you can really see the house. And Millay really chose it for that reason. I mean, she lived in the Greenwich Village scene, and most of her poetry, she was inspired by the beauty of nature that she remembered as a little girl from growing up in Maine. And she really needed that solitude and natural beauty to be inspired. So she created an out-of-the-world kind of place. And it was good for her. That's so good for us because it's a little daunting to try to get people to know that we're there to visit. But very little has changed at the house over the years. These are a couple of vintage shots of the house when Millay lived there. And then you can see the house as it is today. So very little has actually changed. So we're trying to do everything we can to keep it the way it was. And Holly mentioned that Norma, she did this very strange thing about not moving anything in the house. She virtually for 36 years that she lived there. She lived there longer than Vincent did. And yet she lived in shoeboxes. She lived around her sister's things. She didn't want to disturb anything. She really believed that it would be a museum someday, and all of these artifacts have to be preserved. So unlike a lot of house museums that you go to and they're either vacant, they have no furniture in them at all, or they're finding that they're buying replicas of things or old family pieces they're trying to acquire back, we have everything. We have her clothes, we have her shoes, we have her makeup, it's just mind-boggling. We're still opening boxes and uncovering things that we haven't ever seen before. So it's a treasure trove of treasures. So this is Millay's bedroom. This is the foyer of the house, the staircase where she was found dead. There are highlights of the tour, as well as Millay's workroom and her enormous bathroom, which was very unusual for a house of that size in that day. And then this is her writing cabin. It sits up on a grassy knoll above the swimming pool, so she could work there all day. She worked there 12 months out of the year. She lived very, very simply, as you can see, even though she made a lot of money. But the writing cabin has just anything a poet would need, including the wood stove to keep her comfortable in the wintertime. And of course, there's never a dull moment in terms of the views on the property. Everything from wide open meadows to babbling brooks. Any time of the year, especially fall, it's my favorite time. The colors are amazing. And there's always something in bloom in the gardens at Steepletop. And Ted can attest to this when he came to visit us. I dragged him over, I think, all 200 acres of the property because there's so much to see. And our visitors don't get a chance to really see the grounds. So this year we started a hiking Steepletop tour that we give about 5 times throughout the season. In fact, there's one this Saturday if any of you would like to come up and join us. It's about a 2-hour tour, and we really hike over all of the grounds. So look at our event pages on our website. There's another one coming up the weekend of October 10th, which should be magnificent. That's a peak color out there, so it'll be a great time to hike Steepletop. Another feature of the property that everybody loves is the poetry trail. This is along the old wood road, which is where Millay and Eugene used to harvest their wood for the wood stoves and the fireplaces in the house. And it's now the poetry trail. There's poems of Millay's all along the way that you can hike this trail and stop and ponder. And it culminates at the gravesite at the end of the trail, which is where not only Vincent and Eugene are both buried, but also Norma and her husband Charlie Ellis are there, and the girl's mother Cora is also buried at this site. So, as you can imagine, with the amount of property we have, the restoration and preservation efforts are expensive, and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of money. We don't embark on anything unless we've raised the money first, and we have been very fortunate that we have good donors who will come in and help us restore the place. There are a few rooms in the house that are not yet open to the public because they just are in need of restoration. We finally opened the dining room 2 years ago. This was a picture of what the dining room looked like before the restoration, and this is how it looks today. So we had to basically peel back all the stuff to find the treasures as Norma had left them there intact. Then the visitors' cottage, this was the house across the road on the second farm that Millay bought, and it was in really bad shape. And we were very fortunate. A family donated in memory of their mother a large chunk of money to help us restore this. We badly needed a new visitor center, and for our expanding staff and to perform all of our educational functions. So this, not this past winter, the winter before, we restored the cottage. This is what it looks like today. And then the interior, the amount of work was extensive. We had to remove asbestos, sand paint off the floors, put in a new HVAC system, all new wiring. It was just really a mess. And today we have a nice place for a gift shop, an exhibition space, and staff offices on the second floor. And even last summer, Millay's chicken coop got fixed by our volunteer staff. It was totally done by our volunteers. And in the fall of last year, we realized that Millay's extensive library, with over 3,000 volumes of books, many of them first editions, they're quite valuable, are just deteriorating, and we needed to do something not only to preserve them, but also all of the treasures in the house. So we did a fundraising campaign online in Indiegogo, and we raised the necessary funds to put in 2 new furnaces, because the house requires 2. They were both well over 55 years old and on their last legs. We did that. We put in central air conditioning and also a humidification system for the library. So it allows, hopefully, at least the books and artifacts to be preserved for many years to come. The grounds, as you can imagine, require extensive work because while you can mothball the house, you can't mothball nature. It just continues to grow. And Millay had, one of the integral parts of their lives there was the large kitchen garden because they used it for everything, for their flowers, their food, they did their canning, they made their own wine, they tapped the trees for maple syrup. So it was an important piece of their lives there and necessary for us to begin the restoration. So we started it was a 7-year restoration project. The photograph on the left, you can see, was what it looked like in probably the early 2000s, and nature had totally claimed it. And then the second photograph is sort of the mid-restoration, and Michael Gardner just completed the restoration last summer, and this is what the kitchen garden looks today. So it feeds our staff with plenty of vegetables, and there's a lot of great flora there for the visitors to come and see when they're there. And also this summer, Michael started the restoration of the formal rose gardens on the property. This is a vintage shot of Vincent and Eugene underneath the arbor in their just completed rose garden. And the photograph on the right shows, unfortunately, the overgrown rose garden. And then this is what the rose garden looks like today. The first tier of it has been restored, and the arbor has been replaced. And we have these garden gates that Millay created 13 outdoor garden rooms. Each was accessible by these wonderful gates that had a birch and myrtle fence between them. It is our mission to restore every one of these 13 outdoor garden rooms. It'll take us a while, but we do want to do that. And the first step was really to restore the gates themselves. These are a couple of shots of what they look like. You can see in an early probably that shot of the roundels, the painted roundels, that was around from the 1980s. Eugen commissioned Norma Millay's husband, Charlie Ellis, the painter, to paint these, and there are these wonderful paintings that graced all of the garden gates and the summer house. They've now been taken down for safekeeping in their own exhibition in our exhibition gallery, but they've lasted all these years because Charlie had the good sense to paint them with automobile paint, so they've lasted outdoors all these years. But the gates did not weather so well, so our volunteer staff again rebuilt the garden gates this summer and used all the original hardware, so they're back in shape and ready to go. And another piece of the property that was, of course, integral to their lives was what Millay called the ruins, because it was the site of two old barns on the property that they tore down to put in what they really needed, which was a swimming pool and a bar. So the ruins consist of 3 rooms, those 2 rooms, and then the dingle, which was an outdoor room where they played badminton and put on plays. But these 2 rooms, the pool still exists today, although no longer looks quite that nice. And the bar was, of course, very important. But throughout the years, that beautiful arborvitae hedge that was around the pool that you saw in the previous shot, with Millay sitting there, became grossly overgrown and dangerous. There was the last vestiges of the pergola that was severely deteriorated, and it finally succumbed to a winter storm in 2010. So we've cleared all the arborvitae trees away. The pergola is long gone, of course, and it is our mission by the end of this season, so hopefully by the middle of October, we will have the pergola rebuilt. You can see we're in the middle now of digging out the foundation, which is where the old bar used to sit. We still have the bar, that's also in storage. That will be restored and put back in its rightful place underneath the pergola, and that will happen by the end of the season. So we're really thrilled about that. But so there's just so much to see and do at Steepletop, and we work tirelessly with our huge volunteer staff to really make this happen. And we all really feel that everything we do on the property invokes the true spirit of Vincent and Eugen, 2 people that created Steepletop. So if you haven't been, I invite you to come. I promise you it's an easy day trip from New York City. You just drive up the Taconic, the beautiful Taconic Parkway, so it's a nice 2-hour drive. There's only 3 turns. You get off at Route 203, you drive east on 203 until you hit Route 22, and from there you follow the Heritage Trail signs that the state of New York put up for Steepletop, and it's just up the road, not even on 22, not even a half a mile, and you find yourself on East Hill Road, which is the home that Steepletop is on. So please come to visit us. If you haven't signed up for our email newsletters, please do. Michael's in the back there with some sign-up sheets. We'd be happy to take your email addresses and make sure you get all the information. There's a few newsletters still left over there. But do come and visit us. And again, I thank you so much for joining us. It's been our pleasure to bring Millay and her life at Steepletop and Greenwich Village here tonight to all of you. So thanks so much.